Alex, how do you pronounce his name?
Raden.
Raden.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And last time you kind of gave us a little bit of information about your, like, how life was in the war, but I kind of want to go over some of that stuff again.
Right.
After the Nazis came to Warsaw, how aware are you of, like, what was going on?
It didn't take very long when the Nazis came into Warsaw. We didn't expect what was going to happen. We didn't know, but within a few weeks of when they arrived, I may have mentioned this, that they took hostages right off the street, and they announced their names on posters around the city, saying that we are now the occupying powers, and if anything is done by anybody in the population against our occupation, we will execute these hostages. And it was like 50 names, and people were afraid. So of course everyone was just following the orders of the Germans. And within another few weeks afterwards, they began to execute their mission, which was to get rid of the Jewish people from Poland, and they did it in steps. So the first step was to move all the Jews, the population of Warsaw, into an area which we referred to as the ghetto. And of course, this was done in all the big cities in Poland and in other countries where there were Germans occupying. But I'm only familiar with what happened to us in Warsaw. We were evacuated. We actually had to find a place to live in an area that was designated for the Jews. So my father and mother looked around and found an apartment, a very small apartment, sort of a one-bedroom. There was 4 of us, and it wasn't, too small, but it was smaller than the one we had. We gave up our place and moved to this place on a street called Goucher Street, Ulica Goucher, and I don't remember the number of it, but it was there. It was on the corner of another street called Pavia, where there was a German prison that they kept for people like those 50 hostages and others that they. And so we lived there, we moved there, all of us. We gave up the beautiful apartment that we had on Targowa, on the corner of Wileńska, and this is where we settled. And I had to leave everything behind, pretty much, all my things, and my parents did too, all the furniture. And then this was a furnished apartment with very, just minimal furniture. And we were surrounded by Jewish people now, because everybody there, all the people were in that ghetto. They all moved there. So that's where we started our ghetto experience.
Did you take any memorabilia with you or anything?
My parents basically were taking things that they needed, like their papers, their passport, not passport, but their birth certificates and things. We really had no chance to take any memorabilia, as far as I know. In fact, I had no pictures of that period of time, no photographs hardly, simply because we abandoned everything. And the only time when my mother passed away here in America in 1985, we went through her things in the apartment and we found some old pictures. That was the only memory we had of that time of life that we spent in the ghetto. And we were in the ghetto for quite a number of months.
How did your parents react to everything?
My father was a very resourceful person, and he was worried, I'm sure, very much about what's going to happen to us, but he never did it in front of me or my sisters. So in other words, they tried to shield us from the bad things that were happening. I was really too young to really understand everything, but they were very worried. The Germans never revealed the purpose of us being in the ghetto. They simply said, well, the Jews are going to have their own place, like an area where they will have their own little government, they claimed, or sort of their own self-control. And but their purpose was somewhat more insidious in that they were going to eliminate us from there by sending us out to the concentration camps. But that came up later on. So in the beginning, it was just a bad experience to be in the ghetto. It was really quite sad.
What was your everyday life like in the ghetto?
Well, there was no schools. The Jewish community that was in the ghetto organized as much as they could to try to maintain a semblance of normal life. They had little kindergartens and schools for the kids, like a cheder, which we call like a Jewish type school for the kids. And the parents were basically trying to sustain their life by trying to find food. The stores that were there run out of food very quickly, and the Germans would not allow food to be brought in to sustain the population. They figured if people starve to death, they'll have less people to take away to the camps. So everyone, was trying to fend for themselves. Those that had a little more money, or perhaps even jewelry or gold or any valuables, were a little better off, because you could always buy something from somebody that had it already. And it was pretty bad. People, there was no medicine. I don't even remember of any hospitals that were within that ghetto area. So anybody that got sick, if people didn't help them, they would probably end up dying, and they did. Many people had disease, like typhus was a common occurrence in the ghetto. And if someone had typhus, which is an unheard of in America, but back then it was like a common thing. It was infectious, so other people got it. And they would just take the person out and sometimes leave them in the street to be buried, taken away the next day by a burial society, which we also, I guess the Jewish people had someone appointed, or a few people were serving this kind of a function to collect the bodies. And we just walked by the street. If we saw a bulk of it covered with a newspaper, we knew that there was somebody that died and was just lying in the gutter. And we would see little kids begging on the street. Some were selling. They would carry the little thing around their neck with a little flat board, and they were selling papyrus cigarettes. And they were trying to make a little money from that. And others were just simply holding out a cup and hoping that somebody will throw something in their coin or whatever. And it was very bad.
Yes, I can imagine it was really hard for you. How did you?
It was hard. Me and the kids would go out and play in the yard because the building we were in had a courtyard in the middle. And the building was like on three sides. There was like maybe a 4-story building that was in the form of a U shape. In the middle was a courtyard. Originally it had maybe a couple of little trees and some, maybe like a bench or two for people to sit on. But the kids just came down and played on the street. But every once in a while, when we heard the sirens and there weren't ambulance sirens, they were just the German trucks that came with soldiers had like a klaxon, a siren, and we were familiar with that. So when we heard that, we ran into the house, into the apartment, because they just took people off the street and drove off with them. So it was an ongoing thing for a while.
How were you treated by German soldiers?
Well, there was actually no confrontation with us in the ghetto. The Germans, if they came to the ghetto, they came maybe to take pictures or something, just to show that they were not treating the population badly. But every once in a while, they would just beat somebody over the head because they followed the rule, some kind of a rule or whatever, and they just left them lying on the sidewalk. One time, I remember walking with my father, and it was like he was holding me by the hand, and we were just walking on the sidewalk, but to our right there was a wall, which was the wall that separated the Jewish area from the non-Jewish area, and someone from the other side had gotten up to like the third floor and was just shooting at people on the ghetto side, people walking. And all of a sudden my father was like, quick, and he grabbed me and he pulled me towards the wall so that the line of sight would avoid us. Other times we saw those people that take away the bodies. They had a wagon, they would like with a horse, and they would pick up the body, throw them in the wagon, and drive to an exit from the ghetto, because the cemetery, Jewish cemetery, was outside the ghetto wall. One big cemetery that Jews had, and that we were allowed, I guess the people that took the bodies were allowed to go through. And from what I heard, my mother told me later on that there were a few people that tried to sneak by covering themselves on the wagon and pretending they were dead so they could go through the wall, and then on the cemetery they would just like escape. And I think the Germans got a hold of it, and a lot of times they would just like shoot into the wagon, so to make sure that if there was anybody alive, that they weren't there after that. So the Germans were not really anxious to go into the ghetto. They were like keeping us like in a cage, a big cage, and just trying to maintain us until they decided to ship us out.
Were there any non-Jews in the ghetto?
No, there were no non-Jews in the ghetto that I know of. They simply wouldn't want to be there. And those who were used to live in those houses and apartments, as we moved from our place, they moved from those places into some of the Jewish houses and apartments that were abandoned. We traded with somebody. In fact, that's how we got this apartment. They moved to ours. Eventually, the apartment that we lived in before, and those people moved there, the Germans kicked them out too, and took it over as like a headquarters or something for their officers.
Were you like able to like do most of your religious activities?
Okay, so we had a synagogue not too far from us, but like I said, people were so involved with their day-to-day struggles to exist that it wasn't like we would have big services, you know. It was done by mostly of the people that were able to get away. Some of the older folks went there, and the kids probably, I don't remember going, because, you know, we just were busy with things that trying to stay alive. But there was a semblance of Jewish life in the ghetto. There was even a little concert or whatever they could arrange just to keep people from. In fact, the Germans appointed Jewish people to lead, to be like leaders in the ghetto. And their idea was that it'll maintain sort of a reality that you're leading a normal life, so that nobody would just revolt and do whatever. So that they tried to arrange for people to have some kind of a semblance of real life in the ghetto. But until everyone realized what the purpose of it was, when they started to catch people off the street and put them in trucks and drive them away, then people realized that we're going to end up, you know, being shipped out. So in fact, the guy that, I think the man that was in charge, his name was Chernyakhovsky or something like that, and he was like I guess you can call him like the administrator of the ghetto, a Jewish guy. He realized what was going on and he committed suicide. You know, he was one of those that I don't know if he's made it public or not, but everyone knew that he had killed himself because he realized that he was just a puppet for the Germans, you know. So
How are those people who were kind of put in like more authority-like role? Were they good? I mean,
the
did
Germans
they follow the German?
The Germans appointed some, particularly when they were trying to control a big crowd. I guess they picked some Jews and they gave them like an armband, and I guess they call them Judenpolizei, you know, Jewish police or something. They gave them a truncheon and with the armband, and they had somewhat of an authority over the population. But it was just a symbolic gesture. I mean, these people, police people that were appointed, eventually ended up in the concentration camps too. It's just that they weren't taken first. So, the Germans were trying to control us by giving us all kinds of ways. Like they said, anyone who works for a German factory won't be relocated. So everybody was trying to get like a working card or some sort of a card that would allow them to go to the factory and work. And that's how my parents ended up in this factory, which was in the ghetto, but manufacturing wooden shoes. So we all worked in the factory. I actually went there with my sister, and we were just playing. But my parents worked, and they were trying. I guess they were making these platform shoes made of like a piece of wood with a strap on it, and these things were sent to camps where the Jews were already, like Treblinka, Majdanek, Auschwitz, and Buchenwald, whatever. So they got asked to work there, and every day we would go there. But then one day, even that factory was liquidated to some extent because the Germans came and made everybody come down from the factory and told us to line up in rows, and they marched us off. So while they were doing that, they went around on every floor and they were like hitting people with their truncheons, making us. People were hiding under mattresses, and then they came over, they took the mattress away, and they were just banging them on the head. And eventually, everybody got down to the street and marched in like a big line of like 6 abreast, one row after another, and we thought we were going to be escaping from that, but we weren't, because they marched us off. So it was like a long march through the streets of Warsaw. By then, it was abandoned. There was hardly any people around, because those who were in the factory were like the very last consignment of people. And we were marching along and stopped in front of this big railroad station, which we referred to it as Umschlagplatz. It means like a place, I guess, wherever, place of death or something. And there were trains, mostly. There were no passenger trains, I must say that. It was all like cattle cars, big box cars that had only like a small opening. Originally had been freight cars of some kind, and they pushed people in there, as many as could go in a freight car, and many of them they could not sit down because there weren't any seats. They were just standing there, one pushed against the other, and then they would like shut the door of the freight car, with a big bolt, and then that was it. You couldn't get out, couldn't go to the bathroom. I mean, it was a mind-boggling thing to be even there an hour, and the trains, I don't even know how long it took them to get to where the destination. Might have been a day or two, maybe longer, and many of them died or suffocated. But for us, we stood there and waited for that next train or next empty train. There were thousands, there was 1,000 people standing there, and every once in a while somebody would leave the line, and the German would like, there were machine gun people who just standing on the side, they would like shoot them, and they fell down there, and nobody would even go over to them. So they might have been alive, but there was no, there was no police, there was no consequences of killing somebody. A German could kill a Jew and nobody would even ask him any questions. It was just part of his job, I guess. So, but we managed to leave this line by asking a Jewish policeman to let us to walk over to a house and try to get some water. And that's how we ended up. We left the line right there, and we walked, my mother holding my sister and my father holding my hand, and we walked quietly over to a house. And once we were in an abandoned house, which was surrounded, that Umschlagplatz area, there were houses there, but there was nobody in them, because people had already been evacuated first. And we ran upstairs. It was like 4 floors, so we climbed up to the 4th floor and opened up a trapdoor and went on the roof. And the 4 of us just kind of bent our heads down so they wouldn't see us from the ground. And we walked over and over from one house to another. And these houses were like next to each other. And they were like connected, so the roofs you could jump over very easily, even me. But we finally got off like the next block. We came down, there was hardly anybody there, and we went back to our own apartment on Geisha, and that's how we managed not to end up, there was one incident while we walked in that line that I vividly remember, which was while we were walking, we passed abandoned trolleys along the road, along this street. Trolley cars were common in Warsaw in that time. So these trolleys were abandoned and empty. So my father asked me to jump into a trolley while we were real close and lie down on the ground inside the trolley car until the line of Jews would pass, and then leave the trolley car and run back to the apartment where we were. I was a little kid, and I was afraid, and my father was very angry at me, and he practically shook me, like, he says, you have to do this, you have to do this. But by then I started crying, and I said, no, I'm not leaving. And by then we had passed the car and there was no other chance. And then, of course, once we were there, we went to that house and escaped from there, went back to our own apartment. And there wasn't many people left. And so this was the first chance that I actually saw non-Jewish people, coming into the ghetto. By then, there was so little left in the ghetto that the Germans allowed the Polish people that applied ostensibly to trade with the Jews, and they actually came into the ghetto through one of the gates and went from house to house. And many of the houses were abandoned, so they took whatever they saw there, whether it was glassware or pictures or whatever. They put them in bags and they were going to take them outside. And that's how my father contacted that group. He talked to them and he offered them a substantial amount of money. And of course, they allowed us to join them when they left the ghetto. And they had this paper with their names on it. And the German, by some miracle, didn't actually pay attention to every name. And the whole group, there was about 5 of the non-Jewish people, and plus the 4 of us, so it was like 9 or 10 people. There was another Jewish guy also joined them, and we walked out. And once we were on the other side, my father, he actually gave, we knew what was going to happen, so we were prepared. So my father pinned an address, a name and an address into my jacket. And so he said that if you become lost or separated, this is where you should go. This was an address of a warehouse where my father had a partner, non-Jewish partner in the furniture business, who had this warehouse and who was told earlier, I guess by some way, that maybe we will someday contact you, if we have to. And he agreed. So we went out, we were walking, and this non-Jewish woman that held my hand, and my mother was walking along, and then she just says to me, don't look, frightened, just pretend like you belong here, because I was like going like this. When I saw a German, I was like hiding. And we walked, and sure enough, a German did stop us, a German soldier, I don't know if it was like a patrolling or whatever his job was, and he was like looking at us all, and he actually pointed to my father, and by then my mother had moved to the side, but he pointed to my father and the other Jewish guy, and he says, come with me. So they were separated from us, and I ended up holding the hand of this non-Jewish woman who was actually trying to help me. But then when we came to another corner, she let me go. She says, now you have an address, go. And because they were afraid too, because they didn't want the German to think that they're trying to smuggle Jews. So she let me go, and I was like walking along, I didn't know where to go, and I took that little paper out, and I was holding it, and I asked somebody where this is, and they said, just go here, go there, give me directions. And I'm thinking back, all of a sudden, like half a block later, a Polish policeman, they were Polish police. These people did have guns, on this side. And he stopped me. He says, he called me little Jew or something. He says, he grabbed me by the arm and he says, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to my parents or something. He says, no, you come with me. And he grabbed me and I was pulling back. I even think I reached in my pocket. I had like coins, maybe like a Polish coin, and I was trying to give him. And all of a sudden there was like a crowd of people surrounded us, Polish people, and they kept telling the policeman to let him go. You know, in Polish they said, "Oh, let that Zid go. What do you want from this little kid? Just let him go." And the policeman was like looking at them, and I pulled away and I started running down the street. And I ran like crazy. I was running and running until I finally stopped out of breath, and I asked somebody, and it turned out it wasn't very far. So I went to this warehouse. I was knocking on it, and a man came down. It was closed. He came down. He says, "You are Ichik's boy, aren't you, Oleg?" So I said, "Yes." He says, "Come quick," and he locked the door, and he took me upstairs, and there was furniture. It was like a big floor full of furniture, and he said, "You see this couch? You stay here." And then he went out, left me there, closed the door, and when it got dark, there was no lights in there, and I was like sitting on this couch, frightened to death, because, you know, the shadows, I guess it was like a frightening thing. I didn't know what was going on. And then finally I fell asleep, and then the next morning, there was a knock on the door or something, and he came in with my mother. Apparently what happened was, my father was taken by the Germans, and by the time he got to the police station, wherever they took him, he managed to escape. I think he bribed them, so somehow he got out of there, but he didn't want to come for me. He went away somewhere else, and my mother came for me. So she came for me and brought me something to eat, and I think she brought me some bread, and she had a bag of sugar. So I ended up eating bread and sugar, you know, because that was all we had. There was a water sink we could drink, but the bread and sugar was like a lifesaver for me. You know, I ate, and the next night she spent with me there. We slept together there in the bed, and then the next day they had made arrangements for me to go with a non-Jewish family. And this was an arrangement that they had made. I don't know how my father and mother made it, but there was a family named Kosman. There was Mrs. Ada Kosman and the father, and they had two children, Rodek and Lala, two children. They were a little bit older. The girl was older than me, much older. The boy was about my age, maybe a year or two older than me. And my mother says, "You're going to go with them. They're going to keep you until we can get together with you." But before that, she took me, because I said, "I want to see Dad, you know, I want to see my father, where is he?" So she didn't know how to arrange this, but then she somehow figured out a way. There was a barber shop, and she said, "I'll take you to the barber shop, and Dad will come to the barber shop, but don't talk to him. You're going to sit on one chair, and maybe he's going to sit in another chair in the waiting chairs, and you can see him, but don't say anything." Because, you know, we were so afraid that if they recognized one person as Jewish, they would recognize someone else as Jewish, and they could capture all of us. At least if one person alone, then the others would stay alive. So I went to the barber shop, and I was sitting, and I think I already was in the chair getting like a haircut. My mother was sitting there waiting, and my father walked in, and there was German soldiers getting haircuts. They just either walked in or were there, I don't remember, but all of a sudden that changed the situation. There was just no way that I could even say a word to my father, and he just kept looking away from me, but I did see him, and he saw me. Basically that was the last time I saw him, because we never together after that. And my mother too. She took me out from the barber shop. My father left, and she took me to a church which was empty, and she said, "Sit in one of the pews, someone will come for you, but I can't wait here because I don't want them to see me." And so she left, and I was sitting there, and a few minutes later, or maybe 20 minutes later, a woman came, Mrs. Kosman, Ada Kosman, a Polish lady, and she took me by the hand, and we went to her. She had an apartment, and that's where I was. My mother gone, my father gone, and my sister gone. I didn't know what to do, but they took me. And they, so from what I know of the others, is only by hearsay, what they told me later. And they took me, they had an apartment in a place called Mokotów. It's a section of Warsaw. And she was nice to me. They gave me food, they gave me drink. And their apartment was a basement apartment. So there was no window directly to the street, but there was like casement window. If you to see the window, you had to look up. But the days came, like the weekday, and Bodek and his sister Alala went to a school, some kind of school. But they wouldn't let me go because a lot of reasons, I would be recognized, or depends. I mean, if you could go to the bathroom and the Jewish kids were circumcised in Poland, no one was, other than the Jews. So if they saw somebody like that, even they recognized that he's Jewish right away. So they wouldn't let me out of the house. But then Bodek came home, some of the kids with him, and I noticed they were looking through the casement window, and they were yelling, "Who do you have down there? A gypsy or something?" Because I was dark and they were all light, blonde, and I was different in a way. So when Mr. Kosman came home that day, his wife said, "We have to move because, it's too dangerous here." The neighbors or the kids would just report that there's somebody living there who doesn't look like them, and even though they said he's a cousin, but it was hard to make them believe that. So we moved, and they were nice. They moved to a small town outside Warsaw. It's like a farming town called Nowe Miasto. I guess it's called like New Town, Nowe Miasto, near a river called Pilica. And it was a farming, and they got a little farm, a little house really. They didn't have a farm, but there were farms all around. And we lived in this house, and that was where I spent the next, was a year and a half almost, till the war was over with them. While I was there, I didn't know what happened to my parents. I didn't know what my sister, I just didn't know, and neither did they. There was no phones, there was no communications, and they wouldn't have even tried because it was dangerous if you talked to somebody who was Jewish or if you communicated with them. So I was there, and I was a little kid, and they treated me like one of the members of the family. It was a little awkward. They were Christians. They celebrated the holidays, like Christmas and Easter. Polish people are very religious, generally the population, Catholics. And during Christmas, of course, they had made a little tree, it was primitive, but they did the best they could. And the Bodek and Lala would, play and everything. And me, they gave me a token gift or some kind too. So everybody got a gift, so I did too. But I wasn't their son, and I felt that. And I always had that hope that someday this will be over and maybe I could reunite with my parents. But it was very slim chance. I was just trying to figure out how my life will be. There were times when the Germans came to the town, but we knew from others that they were coming. So Mr. Kosman sent me down to the river, and there were logs. The river had floating logs. I guess lumberjacks cut off trees and floated them down the river. So their logs were stationary because they waited for other logs behind them or whatever. They told me, go down to the river and stay down there until we tell you it's safe. And the Germans would come to the town and go from house to house and look for Jews, because there were Jewish people hiding in different places. And Bodek, the son, would run down to the river and warn me that don't come up yet. And I stayed down there by myself and tried to wait until the Germans leave, and then I would come up again, and I was safe, because the Germans had gone out of the town. Other times in the morning, the Germans weren't there, but the Kosmans had to have somebody start a fire early in the morning because there was no central heating. It was just like you had to make a stove, like where you cooked, and the fire would warm up the house. So Oleg, go make the fire. So I did. It was early in the morning. Other times they send me to get milk from the farmer, also early in the morning. I would take like a little metal thing, like a jug, and go over there to the farmer, and he would give me milk from the cow, you know, when I brought it to them. And then the winter came, there were snows and all these things, and finally, the end of the war came in 1945. So, and again, we heard lots of shooting. There were cannons, and the Germans were escaping. They were going back towards Berlin, you know, and the Russians were following behind them. And we saw in the night, especially, these tracer bullets across the sky, and we knew that something is going on. And eventually, we saw the Germans. The highway was like maybe 1,000 yards in back of our hut. It was a highway, and the German trucks were day and night. They were going, and but then the Russians got real close, and the Germans left their trucks standing there, and they run off, you know, trying to, and you know, they run away. And before the Russians even were actually there, because they knew the Russians were coming, so they knew they didn't have a chance. If the Russian catches them, they was going to kill them. So the Russians were really, really, you know, very much angry at the occupational forces, because the Germans were very cruel to them, and particularly in some of the villages where the Russians had family, and they were all killed out. So the soldiers were like really, you know, mad, and they came to our village. They liberated us, and the trucks were there, but they were. And then we got in the morning. We came out. We were like hiding in a bunker. It was like they dug a hole. They covered it with logs, and we were all sitting there because of we were afraid that the shrapnels would come on us. And so I remember one German. I think he came down. We thought he was going to kill us all, but he didn't have a gun or anything. And he says he wanted Mr. Cussman to give him civilian clothes, and he was going to give him whatever he had on him. And Cussman gave him some, like a suit or a jacket, and because he was afraid. So the guy put it on his clothes, and he left us. Thank God he went away. But finally, we were able to come out of the bunker, and then we knew we were sort of liberated. I could see Russian tanks coming behind the Germans, and the Russians came down. They were like smiling and, you know, talking to everybody and saying, we're gonna, you know, get the Germans. We're going all the way. In fact, they hung up like sheets on the tank across, and it says, "Na Berlin," meaning we won't stop until we get to Berlin. You know, that was their way of saying it. So there were big tanks, T-34s, I think they were like a Russian tank, and there were Germans dead everywhere in the fields from shrapnels, from bullets, from who knows what. And the Russians, all of a sudden, they brought a whole group of German soldiers like captured. They were stripped of their, you know, their epaulets. They were just like having torn uniforms, and they told them that they have to go and bury all these German dead that were all over. And some of the German dead were already stripped of their possessions. You know, the farmers came out in the middle of the night, and they were like taking their shoes, because we didn't have good shoes, and they took their shoes and everything. Finally, they took away all the dead, and some of the farmers went and tried to get the trucks, empty out the trucks. And I remember Mr. Kosma went to a truck and took out like a rucksack, you know, a backpack, 2 or 3, I think, and he brought them home, and they were all going through it. The Germans, his whatever he had in there, I don't know, maybe rations, like chocolate or something that they had, provisions that they put them on the truck so they wouldn't have to carry it. But of course they were not dead or captured, and that's how they went away. And then the Russians liked the house we were in, this little hut, which was, they had an upstairs, but it was like basically very primitive. and they told us, Cussman, me, and Ada, everybody to leave. And then she started crying and carrying on, and so they said, okay, you don't have to leave. Well, downstairs it belongs to us, and you can go sleep in that attic, whatever. So we all went to the attic, and the Russians made it like a headquarters. They put a radio there, and like a walkie-talkie or some kind, and they were sitting there. And then they told Mrs. Cussman that she has to cook for them. And so she cooked, made like a dinner. And they had whiskey, no, they had vodka or some Russian drinks, and they were like a big table. And I remember Mr. Cussman got a few drinks too. And suddenly I think he banged on the table, and he said in Polish, but some of them knew Polish too, the Russians. He pointed to me, a little kid, and he said, Ivrei, meaning in Russian it means Jew. He pointed to me, and he tried to explain to them that he saved me from being killed. So, the Russians, they clapped him on the back, and they were like applauding him. And they picked me up, put me on the table, and they were all like, they were all laughing and smiling that I was saved. But then they actually abandoned us after about a week or two. They picked up their trucks and their jeeps, whatever. I think they had jeeps, if I'm not mistaken. They had Studebaker trucks, because I think the Americans were sending shipments of things like trucks and jeeps for the war effort. They call it Lend-Lease, I think, and they were giving the Russians a lot of the stuff was American, but the tanks were Russian, and they left. By then they left. And then the winter was so bad, there was snow almost up to your waist, and there was no snow removal. I mean, it was a village, and you had to trudge through the snow. We didn't really have shoes. We had we wrapped our feet with woolen scarves. We made shoes out of woolen scarves and walked. The Russians didn't have shoes either. They had what they call valenki, which is a shoe made of a blanket. It was shaped. It's a blanket that's firm, and they made it a shape of a shoe. It was pretty good because it kept you warm, but eventually if you were in snow, it soaked through. So we walked in the snow, and a week went by, another week, and I was sitting in the corner and crying because the war was over in our neck of the woods and where we were, and I didn't know what's happening in Warsaw or Prague or any other places. And by then, the Cussmans were consoling me. They said, don't worry, your mother will come for you. Then, of course, one night, we were sitting by the fire. Everybody had to have a fire, and there was a fireplace and the fire. The Russians had left. We were sitting by the fire, and there was a big banging on the door, and Mr. Cussman went to the door and opened it, and I still remember, I looked, and I couldn't tell who it was, but it looked like a snowman. It was covered with snow and icicles all over. And then, come in, and she says, I am, Genia Zhenjinska. Oh my God, it's your mother. My mother saw me, she started crying and hugging, and she sat down with us, and they talked and they told things. First I found out that my father was killed. She says, they killed my father, Isaac is dead. And he says, and your sister, I gave her, I don't know exactly when I'm going to get her back, but I want you to come with me to Warsaw. And so we said goodbye to the Cussmans. They gave us provisions, and it turned out that this was maybe 100 miles, maybe less or more, I don't know, but from Warsaw. And so there was no trains, there were no buses, there was nothing. It was just a road that was stamped in the snow, but there were hundreds of people walking. Everybody was trying to go to wherever they were displaced from. So we started walking, my mother and I, we walked and walked and walked, and then at night my mother went to a farm nearby and begged them to let us sleep overnight. And we slept. We tried to get a spot near the oven where it was warm, but other people, of course, did too. So a lot of times we ended up just huddled together trying to sleep. The next morning we got up and we went on the road again. And then I think after a day or two, my mother was worried about me, and so there were sleighs with horses sometimes drove by, and sometimes there were trucks that went by. But the trucks were mostly Russians; they wouldn't stop for anybody. But she in fact told us that when she walked from Warsaw to here, she did get a ride. I mean, she hitched a ride. But now a sleigh stopped near us for some reason, and she took me and put me in the back of the sleigh, like it was like a platform. And she says, "Go with them, and I'll catch up with you, so you wouldn't have to walk." And then for maybe 20 minutes or maybe an hour, half hour or more, I was on the sleigh, and then I started screaming because I didn't see my mother. All I saw was strange people, so I screamed so loud that the driver of the sleigh, the horse driver, stopped and says, "All right, get off." So I got off, and I stood there, and people were passing by, and I was just standing there looking, and after a while I was crying, and I think it took a while, but my mother finally got there. She kept looking, and sure enough, she found me. And then we continued on, and we came to Warsaw, and she had a small rented apartment. My father turned out, I found out from my mother that what happened was the Warsaw has a river between Praga and Warsaw, Warsaw and Prague. They're like Minneapolis, St. Paul, sort of like a twin city. But we were on the Praga side, and the river was between us. Now it turned out that the Russians had already, they stopped right by the river. And that was before, while I was living there, this was going on in Warsaw. They stopped by the river, and they for some reason they waited. There was an uprising. The Warsaw had an uprising. Besides the ghetto uprising, there was also an uprising on this side. So I don't know, I guess the Russians figured they want to get rid of some of these Polish, what they call them, leaders or agitators. So they figured the Germans will kill them all, then we'll cross the river. But the Germans they were not going to evacuate because they knew the Russians were coming. But they saw the tanks, so they captured a whole lot of people off the streets, and they brought them to the river, and they made them dig like a anti-tank ditches right along the river. And so my father was one of those that they captured. And from my mother, who told me that he was digging the ditches. And while he was there, a policeman, or German or Polish, I don't know, he told the German who was standing with like a gun, an automatic gun, and that this guy over there, he says he's a Jew. And the German just pulled the trigger and shot him. He shot him, he fell into the ditch, and then of course, no one told my mother, but later on she found out, because what happened was the Russians did cross the river, and then they sent bulldozers and they covered up the ditches, and anyone who was dead in the ditches was just covered up by the bulldozers. So there was not even a way of finding out where people were buried, because the tanks would just go over it and press down the ground. So this is what my mother told me, that my father was dying, dead, and along the river, and he was that's where he ended up, in that ditch. And then she came back with me, and she said we rented an apartment. It's one-room apartment in a Polish family that owned the apartment or rented it, and they rented us the back room. So to go in and out, we had to go through their apartment. There was no separate entrance. So we lived there with my sister, me, and my mother. Excuse me, my sister wasn't there yet. My mother. And my mother said to the non-Jewish people, she says, please, the name was Tchaikovsky, and she said, I'm going to get your daughter, Frida, so stay with Oleg and help him, take care of him, give him food and so on. And then and she left. So I found out later what happened. She went to a town, I think it was called Katowice. It's a town in which the last time that my sister was there, because that's where they gave her. These people told my parents, my father, I guess, that we were going to move to Katowice, and there we're going to keep your sister. But they weren't honest. Even though they took money and they took gold, whatever my parents had, but my sister, the next, maybe a week or so after they had her, this was 1945, my sister was 138, so she was only 7 years old, I mean, just about 6 something, and I was born 34, so I was older, but my sister was a little baby, and they gave her, they actually went to an orphanage, which was run by a Catholic Charities, nuns, Polish nuns had an orphanage, and they were like foundlings, kids who were wandering the streets. They took care of them, and they brought my sister there, and they told them, and they didn't say the truth, they said, we found her in front of our house, and we can't take care of her, take her. And besides, they were afraid of the Germans. This was during the last part of the occupation, and they left her there. But when my mother came to the address where those people were living, and she went to their house, I mean, they're upstairs, they lived in an apartment, and she said, hi, Mrs. Zunjinska, I want my daughter, Zosha, I want her back. Where is she? This was after the war, right after the war. So, first they denied. They screamed, get out of here, we don't know anything, you crazy woman, leave us. And my mother realized there's like, what do you do? They denied it. So she ran downstairs screaming like anything that my daughter was taken, kidnapped, and just so happens that the Russian Jeep, the Russian had police, like, I guess they were like equivalent to American MPs, you know, Russian MP, military police. They stopped the Jeep, and one of them said, what happened? You know, like they thought she was mugged or something. And my mother pointed upstairs and she said, they took my daughter, she's Jewish. So 2 Russians from the Jeep went with her upstairs with guns. And as soon as they walked into the apartment, I think these people got so afraid, they were like shaking, and they started like crying, and they said, no, we were afraid, yes, we know, but you know, you can't blame us, like we thought we were going to get killed, but we know what we did with her. So the Russians said, come with us, you know, and they took them, and in a Jeep, and they drove to the orphanage. And I think my mother went in there and talked to the nuns and explained to them, and these people were like trembling, but they finally spit out what happened. They said, on so-and-so date, we brought a little girl here. So they had pretty good records, I guess, and they found the book where they recorded the dates where people were different kids. And they said, yes, she's here. So my mother says, where? And I think they pointed to the outside the playground where they were playing. And my sister was one of the kids, but she was little. The stomach was like blown up from hunger, I guess, from not. Maybe the nutrition was bad, and you know, her eyes were like big, and she somewhat unkept. I mean, as much as possible, they took care of the people. But so my mother ran down and grabbed her and started to hug her. But I think my sister was afraid. She didn't know. She didn't recognize her or something, and she cried. And then the nuns came and said, why don't you stay here a day or two and play with her, and maybe, you know, she'll get used to you. And my mother stayed there a couple of days. Every day she came, brought her like hot chocolate or something she could get in a store, and my sister got used to her, and then she took her back to Warsaw. And then she like brought her back, and the three of us started to, try to make a new life for ourselves. So that's the way we survived the war.
Okay.
Just, I'm gonna switch the tape.
Oh, okay.
For your next question. Do you know, like,
Yeah. I think you gotta press.
Yeah, I'm almost
Is it
done. I mean,
still-
this
I think I
was
stopped.
the war
It's
experience.
still recording.
As much as anyone left in the family that we had, all the uncles and the aunts and cousins, nobody was alive anymore, except for those people that had actually emigrated from Poland prior to 1939. And some came to America, some went to Argentina, but from our own family, there just three of us were alive.
Oh,
It's
wait.
okay.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you just quickly state what, like, again?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's September 28th. This is the second part of the second interview. That's it. I don't know what else to say.
If you want to clear anything up, you could.
No,
Yeah.
I don't know if you have anything that I left out. I wouldn't, I don't want to
Did
talk
you say,
about.
because it's
the
hard to
future.
remember, did you remember in the barber shop?
Yes, I did. I
You did?
told him. Yes, I told him everything
Yeah.
that I could say. That came to my mind
Yeah.
from that experience. I survived. What can I say? We were my mother, and of course she was alone. There was no. There was no welfare. There was no social security. I mean, this was Poland after the war. Everybody had to fend for themselves. So my mother tried to get a job, and there was no jobs. So she basically tried to sell things, buy them from one wholesale place and sell them to like individual people. She tried to sell pocketbooks. She tried to sell ladies like underwear or something, and she tried to make a living. For me, she tried to put me in a school, but I was left at the war. I didn't go to school till I was 11 years old. I mean, there was nothing, no education. And then my sister was only
You could tell from the
6 or
story.
7.
You could tell from that he was a smart kid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because some others,
So,
5 or 6 year olds.
the big thing really is that the generation, my generation, the people that survived, the hidden children and others, those who survived the camps, they grew up pretty fast.
Yeah.
And an 11-year-old was like, you could say that the person had enough understanding of what today's maybe college students, who are in their 20 or whatever. I mean, there was just everything. We really had an understanding of life and death, for one thing, and we knew that this was, a miracle that we survived.
Yeah. I have a question.
Yes.
How was living with the Cosmans? Were they, was every day difficult, or were there
Well,
good days?
As I mentioned, when I only lived with them in their original apartment for about a few months, and pretty soon there was some rumor that they were hiding someone who either was a gypsy or a Jew. So we had to move. And when we moved, we went to this Nowe Miasto. They rented a little hut in a village, and they treated me, I would say they treated me okay. I didn't expect any better because I wasn't their child. I was a stranger in their house, but I was little, and I was a companion to their kids. So they really gave me a good care, provided me with things. They weren't going to teach me the Aleph Base or the Hebrew alphabet or anything. They didn't know it either. So they were just like treating me like one of theirs. And sometimes I did get chores that they didn't want their kids to do, and they could ask me to do, and I did it, even though I was a little. But like I said, I went for the milk in the morning, I started a fire, and I swept the small little place. This was a hut. It was like the floor was not tiles. It was, believe it or not, I think it was packed down sand. Just the way the huts were built. And there was kind of had to, there was no air conditioning, of course not, but there was no heating. And then somebody had to make a big fire, so the stove was in one place, and from the stove there was like a pipe that went around the room, and the heat went into the pipe, so anybody who was near the side of the room could get warm. And eventually, if you kept the fire going, it permeated the rest of the house. They, all in all, after the war, the Kosmans, of course, survived, and my mother, she was very resourceful, and she even helped them subsequently while she was in Poland. She brought food to them, she sent them once in a while some money, just to kind of keep things going. He worked on the railroad. He was a railroad person, like a federal employee, whatever you call the railroads. And but he also, unfortunately, he was like to drink, and I remember him coming home and sort of, either acting funny and just lying down or sitting down and being a little bit drunk, but he was never abusive to his wife or children, but he did like to drink. And he knew my father before the war. After the war, when I moved to America, he wrote a letter which I kept for a long time in Polish. I probably couldn't understand it now that much, but at the time I read it and I showed it to eventually my sister saw it, and I think she took the letter, but she says she didn't. But it was a long letter, and it described a little bit about my father, which his experience with my father, that how he was resourceful, how honest he was, and how generous he was, and all the things about him that was kind of a testimonial to my father that Mr. Kosman knew. And we helped them. I myself sent packages to them for a while, but eventually I think they stayed in Poland, and the son, Bodek, was my age. As he grew, I think by the time he was like 20, he was arrested by the communists for anti-government activities or something. He ended up in jail, and Mr. Kosman passed away. I think he had cirrhosis or something, some liver disease. He died. But what happened to Mrs. Ada, I don't know. Of course, Lala is probably in her 80s now.
Want to drink because you might be tired?
No, I'm fine. But it's kind of, that part of the story was in the past. I wrote a letter to the Yad Vashem, and I submitted their names in a brief history.
Holocaust Museum.
Yeah, so
Their
that
name is
much
put
I
into
did.
the righteous.
That I felt.
When we visited with our grandchildren,
Yeah, we looked up.
right away they looked up and the name was there with the
So the
Right.
thing was, it's something like you might think, well, gee, who wouldn't keep an orphan, But the truth is, it was a time when if the Germans had located a Jew, they would kill the whole family. I mean, everybody in there, they would shoot them all, and they would say, well, they were harboring a fugitive or something, and there would be no repercussions because that was the way they dealt with the population. They would so they were taking a big chance by keeping me. My father survived till he was killed by getting odd jobs and hiding and just kind of living among the population. They knew Polish very well. My mother dyed her hair blonde, and she got a job with a family, like a nurse, with a sort of a well-to-do Polish family. And that's how she survive the war.
What languages did you speak?
Polish. I spoke Polish, and that is all I spoke until I was 12, until I was 13 years old, and then of course I spoke English because I left Poland. But,
And Hebrew?
no. My parents spoke when they didn't want me to understand, and that was I was a little kid while I was still with them. They would speak Yiddish, which was like not Hebrew but Yiddish, a Jewish kind of a mixture language that Jewish people spoke in Europe, even here. But I never really learned it well until I came to England and America, and I went to school and, met people and spoke the language. So now, of course, I speak Jewish and Hebrew and English, but not Polish anymore. I know how to, it's a long time ago. I'm talking about the end of the war, 45, we're talking about 65 years that I have not spoken. My wife is Hungarian, and I haven't learned the language either. Neither has she learned Polish. We both spoke English or Hebrew to each other. So we're married 52 years.
Our daughter is so smart. Somehow, she says, they can't tell me in Hungarian. Just by listening, she picked up a lot, but they don't speak.
Right.
But Hebrew, they are fluent
right.
in Hebrew.
And the thing is,
and English. And
if you speak a language, if you're born to a language, and let's say you're born and for 13 years you speak that language, and then after that you don't, but there's some things that for many years I sort of switched to Polish because I had memorized the times table, and I was a math teacher, so a lot of times, like, if I wanted to think of 9 times 5, so in Polish, 9 razy 5, 35, it's like in my mind that I knew it was 45, but it was subconscious. And then after that, I even stopped doing that. Everything changed into English. And I know that I sometimes meet people that are Polish, very rarely. The only time I do is like, there are Polish maids, let's say, who work for some American family, especially in Florida. There are quite a number of au pairs that come from Poland and work with a family. And if I see them, and sometimes I know the family, so they say, well, speak Polish. So I really I'm not able to speak to them that much, just a few words. I understand more than I can speak.
Yeah.
Like kind of going back to like when you were on the farm, like
Right.
when you were there, were you like other people in that town? Did they know that you were Jewish?
I only remember one incident. I was walking with Mrs. Kosman, and we were just walking in the village, and she was holding me by the arm, and then she was holding Bodek at the other arm, and we were walking, and then some neighbor or whatever, a person they knows, and says, "Hey, Ada, what do you got there, gypsy?" She pointed to me, and she like froze. She said, "What's the matter with you? Like, what are you saying? He's my cousin from Krakow or something."
Mm-hmm.
She just kind of flipped her off. But I didn't go to school. I was like living there day and night and never mingled with anybody. And if I ever went out, I was always covered up like, the big, like a fur hat or something, and a coat. So, they really never, I don't think the Polish people ever suspected I was a Jew, but the Germans would have probably, if they questioned everybody, but they never did.
Mm-hmm. So
I was not mingling with the population. No one really suspected that I'm Jewish in that farm.
So if someone were to suspect that you are Jewish, do you think they would have told?
They probably would turn me in,
Do you think?
I suppose. Maybe not a very good friend of the Kosmans, but certainly any other people. The Polish people weren't very nice to the Jews, and the history is pretty sad about this, because even after the war, when Jewish people returned to their own hometowns, we returned to Warsaw. For example, we had a store, a furniture store that we sold retail, and it was on Targowa, a big, nice furniture store. When we came back, I think my mother went there, and they said, "We don't know anything. This is our place." It became a flower shop. My mother went to the police, whatever that was police that time, and she gave the report, and she showed them like papers. They just said, "Woman, we cannot change. This was assigned to them, and if it was a furniture store, maybe we could do something about it. But since it's a flower shop, a different venue, there's nothing to do. You do not own this place anymore." And they were, now there are claims, and people going to court trying to get back their property, but at that time, they weren't very nice about anything. And many resented the fact that there were Jews who were still alive, because they didn't expect Jews to come back. They saw them leaving, and that was the end of it. So all of a sudden, there were Jewish people coming back. So it happened in many places, but one particular incident from what I read about and heard about, there was a little town called Kielce. Kielce was a small town, and
Ukraine?
they actually, yeah, it was Poland. It was in Poland. But when the Jews came back to Kielce, where they lived before, they were attacked with sticks and
Many
stones. Many died. And it was like a massacre. It was almost like a pogrom.
Okay.
And this was after the war. So you would say, well, gee, these people survived, be glad. But they didn't like the idea, because they had already appropriated much of the properties of the Jewish people, and sort of, they were living a different kind of life, and they didn't think the Jews would return to claim anything. That's why Poland doesn't have much of a Jewish life at this point, because the Jews wouldn't want to go back there, because of the experience they had in the war. They didn't think that this would be a good place to live or stay. There were Jews there, but not many. I never went back, that I know. And my mother never, once my mother left, she never went back. So my sister, once she went, but that's all.
Okay. Do you guys have any?
Okay.
So what was it like seeing your mother for the first time?
Imagine what it was like. First of all, it changed my whole outlook. I mean, till then, I actually did not think that I will ever be reunited with my parents. I didn't know about my father, of course, but even my mother or my sister. I was resigned to live here. I was only like maybe 10 years old, and I understood that somehow I'll have to find my way. Maybe they will bring me to a Jewish community, and maybe eventually give me over to the Jewish community, and maybe I'll be able to be adopted or something. That was in my mind. I just couldn't imagine that I would be actually living with them, because I still wasn't treated like a real member of the family. So when I saw my mother, I just realized that my life is going to change, because once it was like a link to my past. Here was my mother. My God, like she's alive, and that's how I completely, I guess my spirit was reawakened, and I even cried from happiness, I think, at the time. So my mother would remember, she was like wiping my face, but my mother cried too. Yeah, yes. Yeah, it was a pretty emotional reunion, I would say that. Yeah. So I'm glad I was able to.
Did you see some of the Holocaust movies? You saw the Boy in the Stripe?
Yeah.
There is a film. I called the JCC and I was asking about it. I saw it on the Google. What happened was, during the ghetto, the Germans, and I wasn't aware of it at the time, they sent in photographers into the ghetto. And in those days, of course, the film industry wasn't so advanced, and it was like 35 millimeter films, those big wide films, and they had the cameras, and they took pictures in the ghetto, propaganda. So some of them were like staged. The Jews, they would go in and give the Jews food and then take a picture of them eating. Other times they would say, kids, gather them, like to tell them to play, and they took pictures. But these pictures were not, they were only in a warehouse somewhere. And just now, this past few months, someone found them or located them, or they gave them up or something. They found these rolls of film, and it's the Warsaw Ghetto from the German cameras. And I know it's available, but I don't know where or how to get it. But I saw it on Google. There are a couple of websites that it's amazing. I would like to see it myself, and maybe the Joint or the JCC or somebody will be able to obtain it, it would be interesting for me to see, because in the little trailer, there was a trailer is available on Google, and you could actually see a few of the scenes where Jews are walking, and trading and buying and selling, a fish store or whatever there was there that they took. That was a German films. That was the only evidence of the
But
ghetto
in one
life.
place, Theresienstadt, when the Red Cross came to visit, they forced the people to play the violin.
Well, that was in the camps.
Yeah, so
that's
they
right.
picked some people who knew, they played the
Well,
violin.
yeah, they had an orchestra.
And
Were you in the big or small Warsaw ghetto?
We were in the big ghetto, and in fact, in that movie, in the trailer, I saw one scene. It was like, I'm trying to compare it to what you have here. Like, in Towson, there is a hotel, the Towson, right near the Towson Center, and it has the street is here, and there's an overhead passageway
that's the Towson
between the hotel.
Sheraton.
Yeah, the Sheraton.
Sheraton, yeah.
And this passageway, you can walk from one area to another over the highway. Well, there was one of these connecting passageways between the small ghetto and the big ghetto, and it shows people walking by, many of them wearing armbands, and they're just walking. You could see that scene. Someone took a moving picture of those people walking. So we were on that side, and they were on the other side, and that was the only way to get through. I don't know, I mentioned last time that, I think I mentioned it, but regardless, the only one experience that I remember vividly was that when we were in the ghetto, the kids went to try to find food. So of course, there was no place except if a Polish man would break a brick in the wall and push through a bread, then the Jew would push back money. That was one way to get some food. And the other way was there was a railroad track near the wall and on the other side, and the train would go by there sometimes and stop, and there were potatoes on the train. So I think I mentioned it, but regardless, the kids would somehow crawl through the wall, or somehow they made their way, and they waited. One of them climbed up on the wagon and on the train and threw down potatoes. We all put them in sacks, and we were trying to get through, and some of these Polish kids would chase us, and one had a razor blade and he cut the bag, and the potatoes just fell on the ground. So, we tried so hard to get some potatoes, and many of the potatoes were frozen. You can't even eat frozen potatoes, because once it freezes, it comes like dark. But that was food for us. They didn't even let us to have that, so the potatoes all went on the ground.
I have one more question.
Okay, that's fine.
Did you, when you were in the ghetto or anywhere during the war, when did you realize, or did you ever realize what the Germans wanted to do or why they were doing what they were doing?
We never knew why. We just knew that they hate us, and they want to kill us, and they want to. They call us bad names, and Schweinhund, Jude, this kind of thing, Schmutz. They may have treated their own families in a nice way, or they're all friends, but to us they were very cruel. And the ones who were dealing with Jewish people directly, they were usually the ones that may be more cruel than the ones that were on the front fighting against the Russians. They purposely picked those who wanted to serve in the occupied territories. They knew that these people have to have no conscience, and they could kill a child just as well as kill an adult. I mean, they treated us like just below, Untermenschen they call it in German, below a human being, like subhuman, probably the best way to describe it. So we knew that, and we didn't expect any mercy from them, because they would just as well shoot us. In fact, in the ghetto, when the ghetto uprising took place, I was already on the other side, but while the uprising was there, we saw the flames and we knew that there was something going on in the ghetto. We didn't think there was anybody left, but there were people left in the ghetto, mostly young people who had smuggled a gun or two and made bottles filled with gasoline and like wicks, and they were hiding in the different basements. And when the Germans went in, 1 or 2 Germans got killed because they shoot them, or they came out and they threw a Molotov cocktail at them and exploded. And so the Germans didn't even go hand to hand. They simply brought a cannon and they would like aim it at a house and hit the house, and then the house would collapse. And then people that were in there trapped, they died. And those that were alive, they came up with their hands up like that, and the Germans would just like mow them down with a machine gun. So then they went from house to house, and after the war, when we went back, the ghetto was like leveled. Those parts of the ghetto where you could not tell where there was a street and there was a house. It was like rubble, all everywhere. So they safely broke down all the houses, so that way they could get rid of all the people without harming themselves.
What did you make of that? Though? Like one day, you know, your life is normal, then the next day, the Germans hate you.
You know, my only experience with Germans was when they came to Poland. I didn't really know anything about them, or nothing about them other than what I know now, what I learned over the years. They had a plan, and it came from the top, and it filtered down to the bottom to exterminate the Jewish population. Maybe the gypsies, maybe other undesirables, but the Jews particularly. And even though, you know, when the trials went on in Nuremberg, 1945, 46, the Allies, the Russians, the French, the British, they had a court, the Nuremberg trials. And most of the Germans were, you know, they said, oh, I didn't know, I took orders, you know, they were pointing. You know, so really it was, no one believed them, because they themselves were shooting. Just because you tell somebody, kill these people, what does it mean? You know, that you're supposed to do it? So that's...
Yeah. Sorry, I keep making new questions, but did any of your friends like turn against you, like, or was it just the Germans who kind of brought, like, once the Germans came?
Well, the only people I knew and I had experience with were that family that I was with, and some of the Polish people, and they weren't very nice to me. Like I said, they saw me there, they would have reported me if they could, but they didn't. And the people that I was with were nice. And after the war, I left Poland in 1947. I was only there like 2 years, a year and a half after the war, and I left. So the only people that I knew there were people that I associated with after the war. Most of them were in the schools of one sort or another, where, you know, I was going to be for a little while, and then they would send me to America, but they never did, but eventually. So, yeah. Okay, so what do you think? Did we cover the material? Very nice, we covered. And maybe I'll talk to Eva, and we'll see if there was another